Okay, there you go. I promised you it would tell you you're being recorded. So my name is Michelle Tobias. I am the geospatial data specialist at UC Davis Data Lab. I want to welcome you to Map Time Davis. This is our last session of the school year. How did we get to the end of the school year already? Don't know. But today we have Clancy McConnell is going to talk to us about working with drones for research. For those of you who were excited about it last quarter, we had to reschedule, and I'm super excited to hear what he has to say because I do kite aerial photography and there's a lot of overlap. So this is going to be, I think, super fun. I'm going to paste some stuff in our chat, some links for you guys, just in case you're interested. The first one is, it says the link, I labeled it Map Time Davis schedule. That's more information about Map Time Davis in general. If you're curious, we'll post new schedules for fall when we get closer to that. But there's also links to previous workshops and things like that if you want to check that out. There's also a link in there to our YouTube channel. So if you missed any workshops, you want to watch some stuff, there's the link to that. We've got past workshops videos there. And then I also put the links that I've been pasting the last couple of weeks for the UC Davis community for people who, you know, we've been through a lot in the last quarter, last couple of quarters actually at Davis. So there's a link to the Safe Rides program. If you need to travel around at night and would feel safer having a ride, there's a link to that. And then there's also links to mental health resources for both students and staff. So please make time for that if you feel the need at all. Campus has got some good resources on those links. So I just want to make that available to folks if they need it. So again, today, to get back to the task at hand, we have Clancy McConnell, who is going to tell us about drones in scientific research. And just to give you a little bit of background, Clancy is a PhD candidate here at UC Davis. He works with drones, as I've mentioned, and does work in industry. And he also teaches some of our Intro to GIS classes. I have guest lectured for Clancy. He does a great job, and I've gotten some really good interns out of his classes. So high five for that. So I think with that, I will turn it over to you, Clancy, and you can take it away.
Thank you, Michelle. All right, it's great to see everyone here. Yeah, like Michelle said, I'm a PhD student. I'll be finishing up this year. I kept telling everyone I was going to graduate in June, and anyway, I'll be here till December, and then I'll probably be continuing on. So anyway, I love it. Love to continue connecting with people. I see some of my previous students here, some people I've worked with on different projects over the years. So that's really great. So today, the structure that I kind of have in mind is I have lots of material to present for you, but I want to keep it as more of a discussion. I like to have that format also in my classes to a certain extent. So if you have questions as we're going along, you know, I'll try to keep my eye on like the participant list. So if you raise your hand, you can also put stuff in the chat and I can, you know, check it periodically as we go. And if we don't get to everything in the chat, we can, you know, circle back around at the end and go through each question. I'm presuming there will be a lot of questions. I'm going to try to be as comprehensive as I can today. So, you know, if your question isn't answered at the very beginning, we might get to it a little bit later on too. And if there is something that's confusing or maybe you can't see something on the screen, just feel free to shout out or interrupt. I'm not offended by that at all. Okay, so I'm gonna share my screen here. Okay, thumbs up, we can see this.
It looks good.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, yeah, so in the actual announcement for this seminar, I had all this stuff listed, you know, permitting, licensing, equipment, UC rules, etc. I've adjusted that a little bit. We're gonna instead follow a slightly different list. And by the way, I'm gonna provide these slides to you as a PDF in a Drive folder. I'll put it in the chat later on. So anyway, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I have it there. And all of the links are gonna be active in the PDF. So if you wanna come back to this and you say, hey, I really wanna check out how to become a pilot, I wanna see what that resource was, or hey, I didn't know about that thing, you can go back and find that link in the slides. So like I said, we've adjusted some of the topics for today. So hopefully you're not disappointed that we're not going to cover too much on the industry side of things. Today will be mostly like, how do you just get started with the drones? So this is the format. These are all the different topics that we covered at Drone Camp in 2019 when I went there as a student. So we'll start out with just generally, what do you use drones for? I'll give you a hardware demo. I have my drone here today, so we'll go over some of the basics of that. Of course, everyone is concerned about the regulations and the licensing for Part 107, which is the remote pilot license. So we'll talk about that. Risk analysis and management, which is actually, I think, much more exciting than risk analysis in most other fields. It's a lot more exciting than like being in a lab and talking about not getting chemicals on your hands. Anyway, it's exciting because the stakes are pretty high. You know, we work with big $5 million liability policies, so it's pretty cool. Cool unless you damage something, but hopefully that doesn't happen. Flight safety, which is the same thing. It's actually pretty fun to talk about, I think. Mission planning, which we'll actually do an exercise for at the end, so you get to get hands-on if you want. You don't have to. And then data management. Obviously, you can think there's lots of data involved with drones, lots of pictures being taken. If you go into videography, or maybe you're even using videography for your research, there's lots of data there because the drones record in 4K. We'll get a little bit into photogrammetry, which is the kind of how you overlay the pictures to make one large imagery picture. The same thing you might see on Google Earth. So that's what you would use for your research, and then all of the other products that can cover that. And then, like I said, the last part will be sort of wrapping up with a practice exercise for mission planning. We're not going to have time today to go through a whole ortho mapping, which is that photogrammetry, but I am going to provide you a good tutorial from ArcGIS Pro. So if you have access to ArcGIS Pro through the school or any school, then you can do that tutorial, and it's free. Okay, so I always like to start out with a little bit of participation, and I can open the chat here so you can like type things in and I can see it. Okay, so this first slide, this is a drone picture that I took at a research project. So there are a couple things in here. Anyone want to just throw out some stuff that you see? You can turn your mic on, or you can put it in the chat. What do you notice about this? Power lines. Yes, great. Okay, so we've got some infrastructure. Burn trees, great. So this was obviously some kind of wildfire, so that's probably what we're studying. There's lots of stuff going on in here. Erosion, okay, excellent. So that might be another thing that we might be studying. Maybe there was a wildfire, but we're studying the erosion too. A dirt road, excellent. So it's not just like some quote unquote natural area, but there's also a road in there. Shadows, great. I'm glad you mentioned that. So that's another one of the big things, you have to work around all of this stuff. We'll talk about how shadows are going to influence your results and how to work around that. There's a car, that's great. Yes, there's a car way down here in the corner. That's actually my car. It's my old Volvo, I had to sell it. Down trees, yes. So down trees, another component we might be able to study. Tiny person, yeah, that's me flying the drone. That's great. Yeah, thanks, Emma. And so you're, as the pilot, you're likely going to appear in your imagery. Okay, well, that was really great. You're all welcome to keep throwing stuff in there. So that's really good. So you've seen lots of stuff in the images. And I guess the takeaway that I want you to get from this one is that wherever you go, nothing is really going to be an ideal situation. You're never really going to be somewhere where you can say, oh, I can just breathe easy. Maybe a few places, but there's always going to be something, right? There's terrain, so there's mountains in some places, there are trees, those are obstacles. Power lines might be another one. You have to think about what airspace you're in. And then of course, you're all scientists or maybe affiliated with doing science. And so you've thought about some of the variables we might be looking at: erosion, fire, and then other problems like shadows. What time of day are we doing this? What time of year? So anyway, those are all really great variables. I have another practice one here. So let's throw out a few more things. This one's quite a bit different than the last one. Anytime you want, you can start throwing stuff in the chat. Okay, yeah, so there's a river, that's actually Poudre Creek. Algae, great, so we're seeing stuff in the river. Yeah, so you can capture stuff in like on water using drones, not just on land. Okay, yeah, so up on the left is an ag field. So yeah, like a tractor or something is mowing there. So we've got different land cover types. That's another variable you might look at. Riparian, great. This is the riparian zone. That's what I study. So lots of stuff out there. Is it winter? Yes. So this is winter. There are bare trees. Almost all trees in riparian areas are deciduous. So this area was not burned. So these are all that. Yeah, power pole. I can't quite see. There might be a power pole out here. Yeah. So again, dealing with that infrastructure. Okay, that's great. So that's really good. That's a nice little activity to sort of get us started thinking about some of the things that we might encounter when we're doing drone work, or some of the different variables that we might like to study. And this is very typical, average, basic stuff that you might get out of RGB, red, green, blue imagery. Just something that you don't have to have fancy sensors for. You can just do on a basic drone off of Amazon for $1,000. So I'm gonna shrink down my chat now. Okay, so drone research and applications. This is the first component if you go to Drone Camp, which I recommend that they're going to talk about. So we'll talk about that today. There are 3 general areas I break it down into. There's lots of overlap, and what gets developed in science then informs the industry, and industry is, on the cutting edge of things. So they're always coming up with new methods, and then that spills back over into research. And then there's stuff like today where we use it for teaching, right? I mean, you're teaching about drones, but you can also use drones for teaching certain things. And one of those might be geographic literacy. Another might be just to teach about technology and engineering. So maybe you're trying to work with cameras. And so that might be a good way to teach students about the different types of cameras, is by using drones and drone applications. So those are sort of the 3 sectors. And obviously, they will be focused on the research, but you can extend a lot of these principles to the industry. The difference with the industry is that for the most part, they're not trying to come up with some kind of findings out of it. They're just trying to diagnose problems. Or, on the lower right, I have a picture of a drone being used to fight wildfires. So they put these infrared sensors on them, and they can identify the hot spots with a fire. And they're actually using drones now. This is pretty cool. They're using drones to fight fires. They send them in, and not fight fires, but, well, yeah, they can use them to back burn, but they're using them for control burn. So they send them down with little flamethrowers, and they can set fire to the landscape in certain tactical ways to reduce fire risk and do controlled burns to keep down invasive species. But they do it in a way that, doesn't give people asthma, and that isn't any risk to them having to hold a flamethrower. So anyway, those are some of the applications. These 3 pictures besides the fire one are ones that I took on my research, to get an idea of the idea of things that we can look at with this stuff. Okay, another one here is on the left, RGB, and on the right, NDVI. And NDVI is something that is used for mainly identifying what plants are stressed or what vegetation is alive versus dead. That's simplified, but it's good enough for today. And you can get that using a multispectral camera. So the camera on the left is just what I have on my little drone here, tiny little camera. It's not fancy, it comes with the drone. And that's the kind of stuff you can take pictures with. Very powerful, very versatile, very cheap. On the right, if you go the NDVI route, want to use multispectral data, you're getting into a whole nother level of expense, but you're also opening up all these doors. So that's just one opportunity. And another one that I wanted to show you was, this is the same tree. So we're going to look later on at the same spot with different cameras. In this case, we're looking at the same tree that's circled there. This is from research that I did with Derek Young, who works in PES here. So it's the same tree in that yellow circle, but at different camera angles. And so by getting these different angles, we're able to create a 3D model of the tree using photogrammetry and point clouds. So we don't have to necessarily have LiDAR data, which is sort of this radar using light. We can actually just use an RGB camera and then do a 3D model of that tree. And that gives us a lot of really neat ecological indicators. This is an example of what that point cloud might look like for an entire stand of trees. So lower areas in the canopy are this blue color, and then as we get higher up, it goes from yellow to orange to red, or the highest points. And so it gives you a really nice idea of the stand density, lots of different variables that you can get out of that. And again, the point cloud is something that you don't have to have LiDAR to generate. You can just use photogrammetry. And that's something that's very cheap. Again, it's something you can do even with something as cheap as my little $1,000 drone here. You don't have to, no longer do you have to have a $30,000 LiDAR sensor on your drone, or rent a LiDAR airplane for $100,000 a day. You can just do it for a couple $1,000 bucks. Just one last example here on the forest cover, which is we can create like a digital surface model. So that's pretty much means it's the elevation of the ground, it's the topography with all of the vegetation on top of it. And analyzing that in a machine learning or some kind of AI, that can help us identify how many trees are in an area. So even just using, again, the stuff that we can get out of a really cheap RGB drone, not even a LiDAR drone, we're then able to identify the number of trees in an area, the density of those trees, and even an estimate of how large they are. So again, super powerful ecological indicators just from this kind of thing. So that site that you all helped participate a little bit a few seconds ago, that was taken from here. This is up at Fishing Access 4 and 5 on Poudou Creek, closer to Lake Berryessa, so a little bit down of the dam. And it's got a couple private property parcels on here too. But I did a project for Melanie Truin on here, and you can just tell already that the quality of the imagery is much, much higher than you might be able to get out of satellite imagery. So that's one thing I wanted to point out. Then we can create a digital elevation model, which is the raster. Hopefully everyone's familiar with what a raster is, different than like vector data, but then you can create contours from that. And the contours can be used for landscape architecture, so it can then inform the industry. And just zooming into each one of those locations, you get an incredible amount of detail. Just have a few examples of the site here. This is the riparian corridor. So number one, we were up next to the river and for a little rivulet tributary that goes in there. Number two, we're in the actual creek itself. And so we're starting to identify, and because we're actually able to get pretty good bathymetry out of this because the water surface was clear. We can identify the areas of the creek that are pools and riffles. How many channels do we have? How big are those channels? And this digital elevation model can then be used for flow modeling. And I've used that for my research. Number three is just a zoomed in area of one part of the channel. Number four is showing a ponded area. Number five, higher up on the landscape. So we have this hill, this rolling hill landscape. So anyway, that's just an example there. So hopefully that's a pretty good sampling of the stuff that you can do with drones. And if you have any other suggestions, feel free to throw them in the chat. But what is the contour interval? For that one, that was 1 foot. So I can go back there. Yeah, so that was a 1 foot contour interval. This is really steep. So number five is up there. As you're driving up to Lake Berryessa, on the left and right, those hills are pretty steep. It's where Monticello Dam is. Like go back. So yeah, number three. Yeah, 1 foot. Yeah. And by the way, when you create these products, I created the digital elevation model in ArcGIS Pro, and then you can just create contours from that. You can go either direction, DEM from contours or contours to DEM. When you go DEM to contours in ArcGIS Pro, you can choose whatever your contour interval is. We're going to get to that a little bit later with what the sampling resolution is of this. And it depends on how high you are above the ground. For most of my data, I'm in the like 3 centimeters is 1 pixel. So theoretically, we could go down to 3 centimeter contours. So it's pretty neat. I mean, that would be vertical and we're looking at horizontal, but it's about the same. All right, so now I have this little hardware demo. This would be cooler in person, but we're online and that's okay. All right, right off the bat, there are kind of these two different types of drones. There's the Mavic Pro as like a quadcopter. So you can either have a helicopter style, which is what I have here, and I'll show you this today. So that's just a picture of my drone. And most drones are like that. And then there are some that are more expensive, but have a lot more capabilities in certain ways. And those are these fixed wing drones. They kind of look like, I don't know, they kind of look like if the Batmobile was a plane, you know, they look like a bat. Anyway, so that's an EB drone, if you're really interested. They're quite expensive. They run like 30 to 50,000, depending on what equipment you put on them. And anyway, we'll get to the fixed wing mission planning later. So depending on what equipment you have, that is going to significantly affect the cost. The camera will also affect it. So like here on the Mavic Pro, you're really only going to have the camera that comes with it. You can't modify it. You have to use what's on there. Most drones are modifiable. So you can buy a different camera if you want a multi-spec. You can put that onto a drone with a large enough payload capacity, like the Matrice, which is a really big one. And then the EB drone, you can get that with a LiDAR sensor, and it comes with a multispectral. So anyway, that's partly why it's so expensive. So that'll significantly affect your cost. But for the time being, you can still find a pretty small DJI, which is the industry standard DJI drone, like the Mavic Pro on Amazon, for $1,000 to $2,000. So depending on exactly how fancy you want to get and what kind of data you're trying to collect, you could get into the drone itself for $1,000 to $2,000, and that's what I did. Especially if you buy a little bit older model. I guess I'll just wrap the drone, that part up, just by saying that by the sensors, I just mean, you can buy a LiDAR sensor for the drone. It's a little bit different than a camera, and they're very expensive, 15 to 20,000. There might be less expensive ones. I'm a few years out of date now, but they're pretty expensive. So anyway, you're either putting a fancy multispectral camera on, a better RGB camera, so one that's better than what comes on the drone. All right, so now moving from that, today's not going to be talking about, I'm not going to talk about computers too much, but I just wanted to tell you, in case some of you go into it, if you are going to be working with drone data, you really should be working on a computer that's powerful. And yes, the cloud has really come to the fore with processing capacity. The expenses have come down. And with the university, we have a lot of access to better processing, cloud processing. That said, because you're working with such large data amounts, you really need to be purchasing a good computer. And for laptops, you'll need a laptop for the field. I just put some specs in here for kind of the basic what you'd want to go for. So if you had to buy a laptop and you were getting into drone work, you're going to be looking at spending around $3,000 just for the laptop. Same thing for the desktop, around $3,000 minimum. So anyway, just to give you an idea, if you're going to get into this seriously and you need to start slowly upgrading your equipment, buy the most powerful stuff that you can buy. And just these images I have on the right, images are not here. Maybe I have the images a little bit later on. Anyway, I recommend like the XPS series from Dell. Not a spokesperson, but I just recommend that. They're really powerful. All right, and then the last part would be the support equipment. So I'm going to go over a lot of this today, but working with drones is not just the drone. It's so much more than that. The vast majority of the expense for my drone work has been on support equipment like tablets, ground control points, renting the equipment to do the ground control points. And I just put some basic specs in here for your reference. You want to come back and look at it. How much am I going to need to buy? You're going to want 2 tablets. One is a backup because the first one is going to poop out. It's going to happen at some point. You always want a backup for everything. Batteries. This is another one of those things that you're going to need to invest in. It's really hard because you might end up spending more on the batteries than the drone, which is what I did. My drone was $1,000. I probably spent, I don't know, $1,200 or $1,300 on batteries. And you need a lot of batteries because the battery only lasts for 20, 30 minutes. So if you want to have a good 3-4 hours of drone flight, you need to have lots of batteries. And you can't charge them in the field. They don't charge quickly enough. And then there are just a few other things I mentioned down here. Do not discount if you're going to be going out into the field and doing stuff really far away where you'll be camping. I've done that. I did that for a summer. You're going to need to think about things like, how are you going to charge the batteries? You'll need to have a generator. It's another $300 or $400. You need to invest in all the camping gear. Make sure you have a good first aid kit. You'll need to have an inReach device. So just how fancy you're getting with this is definitely going to affect how much expenses you're going to have. So anyway, for the professors here, you might think about this kind of purchase for a grant maybe. Okay, are there any questions on any of this hardware and demo? I can talk about the drone now. All right, well, maybe there will be some questions or discussion about this. Feel free to stop me at any point. Okay, so I have a video linked in some of this about the demo stuff. All right, just a few basic things on a drone. You know, first of all, this is a quadcopter. It's got or just a copter because it's got the helicopter rotor. So this one launches up and down, and it hovers, and it's pretty neat. You know, you can adjust these for sport or for like actual controlled flights like you would be doing for the industry or for research. So if you want to buy this drone and just get into it for sport, people do that. That's cool. This one's really fast. This is like 45 miles an hour top speed. And if you put it in sport mode, you can do it in such a way that like if you're flying it along and the drone, if you just let off the throttle, the drone will just stop and hover there. You can also turn that mode off and you just run the throttle and you let go of the throttle, and it's kind of like a car and it'll just coast until wind resistance stops it. So there are all kinds of different modes. And depending on what kind of work you're doing with the drone, you're going to be required to operate in certain ways. So like when you do research and when you fly on campus, for the most part, you're required to actually fly in the controlled P mode, where the drone is in its most controlled state. The GPS is turned on. It's got the flight control, so where you let off the throttle, it just hovers. So there are all these safety precautions that we take into account to make sure you're not going to crash into anything. All right, so that's just some basic stuff on the drone. There are flight sensors on most models now. You can still buy some that don't have them. Most drones come standard with them now, but they have flight sensors. This one has them on the front, and then it has them on the bottom. So you'd want them on the bottom so that you make sure that when it's coming down, it doesn't crash into the ground. It can sense when it's getting close to the ground, and it will slow down and let itself down easy. And just to make sure you're not going to land on top of like a tree or a power pole. So it can actually obstacle avoidance sense that stuff. I will say, I don't recommend using that if you're flying 45 miles an hour. But if because it will fly 45 miles an hour when it's come back to you on autopilot. Anyway, lots of details to work out, but just don't rely on the obstacle avoidance system too much. Make sure you're always being cautious. So I'll just show you now the camera. So I've taken the cover off. And the camera is on something called a gimbal. And the gimbal is what keeps that image steady as the drone is moving along. I'll show you a couple examples of, oh yeah, I can do that. So I'll show you a couple examples later on. I'll take that off. So you can see as I kind of touch this gimbal, it's sort of moving around. It's got all of this really neat kind of springs and suspension system in there to make sure that the image stays steady. So all that's already taken care of for you. Even when the drone is flying in 20 to 30 mile an hour winds, the image in the video feed will stay remarkably steady. You'll see almost no quiver in it, if any at all, because that's just how good it is. The technology is really great. So when you're flying the drone, there are kind of a couple ways that it functions. You know, you fly it primarily forward. You're really only flying it backwards when you're taking it off and landing it. But the gimbal is what controls what angle the camera's taking the pictures at. And in our cases, we're really only going to have the camera facing straight down for orthogonal pictures, or at a little bit of an angle to get a little bit more of a 3D picture of that landscape. And I'll show you a couple examples of what that looks like later. The other thing, just before we move on from the drone itself, there's a camera on the bottom. You know, the camera on the bottom is the idea with that. It's a little silly. I don't know if the technology has improved since I bought my drone in 2020, but the idea with that was you could take off, snap a picture, and then the drone would use that picture and the GPS point, more importantly, the GPS point. When it came back to land itself, it would then be able to land itself in the same spot. You know anything about GPS devices, knowing the drone does not have a differential GPS on it, the drone could land itself as far away as 20 or 30 feet from the original point. So it's really not that great. but that's kind of the idea with that camera on the bottom. Let's see, a couple other important features. I mean, the size of drone you're working with matters a lot for safety. If this runs into someone, it's going to hurt, but it's not going to kill them. The wings won't even break the skin, to be honest. I've taken this off a little bit close to me before, and one of the wings has whacked me, and it stings a little bit. It doesn't even break the skin. If you're working with a larger drone that has hard plastic wings, props, rotors, it could even cut your finger off. So it's just something to be really careful of depending on the size of drone you're working with. There are also a couple other things. The drone has these lights on it, red and green and yellow flashing lights. And that's for actually aircraft safety. I mean, it's important when you're on the ground for taking off, but it's also important for aircraft safety. So it has those lights on the bottom. A few of them have them on the top. And the other, I guess the last important thing that we'll look at regarding registration is just on every drone, you need to have a registration number with the FAA. This is an aircraft. Because it's over 1/2 pound, it needs to have an aircraft registration number. So this field is very highly regulated from the federal level. So just another thing to keep in mind. And then even though we have that registration number on it, you can imagine that someone could peel that off. I mean, so now drones, and in light of espionage, now drones are required to have a remote ID, which means they're always broadcasting their identification constantly via some radio signal. So anyway, that's just something you'll want to look at if you go and buy a drone. If you're buying an older model, make sure that it's compatible with remote ID. And I'll touch on that a little bit later. Okay, any questions on the drone demo? I can see a few things in the chat. Yes, so the question, can you add additional sensors like a multispectral camera on DJI drones? Yes, absolutely. And we can look at that when I'm done with the presentation. I can open up the DJI website and give you an idea of the capabilities of the different models. So yes, absolutely. Most people go with the Matrice. I don't even know if they make that model anymore, or the Inspire for putting larger payloads on. A multispectral camera is, it's about twice the size of a smartphone, and it weighs about twice as much as a smartphone. So, it's a significant payload for a small drone. And so you need to make sure that, your drone can handle it, and it will reduce your flight time. Just released a new version of the Matrice okay, that's great. Yeah, so the Matrice is probably their most versatile drone because you can put almost anything on it. It's really big, relatively inexpensive. So cool. All right, other questions about the hardware before we move on? Okay. All right, so this is the part that everyone really wants to know about. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it today because it's something that there's so much good documentation out there about. This is the regulation. So most people are concerned with getting the Part 107 license. There are 3 levels with this. So you need to become certified with the FAA just to fly your drone for any purpose besides as a hobbyist for your own personal use. You can't, it doesn't have anything to do with money. Even if you're a volunteer with an organization, that counts as a commercial pilot. If a friend asks you to fly pictures at their wedding, you should probably get your Part 107. So anyway, it's so tightly regulated that almost everyone that thinks they have an application for their drone should probably be Part 107 remote pilot. The FAA has done a really good job in the last about 6 to 12 months of kind of clarifying all of these regulations. Early on, they didn't know how to regulate it. So there are now these 3 levels. The first one is hobby flyer, called recreational flyer. You still actually have to get registered for that, just so you know. Because your drone is going to be over a 1/2 pound, you need to be registered, and so you have to take this really basic exam. Then there's the Part 107, which everyone has to take for anything above the hobbyist, like I said. And then the 3rd level is not really even necessarily a level. It's more that you have a Part 107 license, but you are working with an agency that's a registered commercial operator. And they're usually like the government, the police. they can fly over crowds, they can do things that we can't quite do as Part 107, and they can also register their own pilots. So I have the links in here. I'll provide these to you later on, and that'll link you to all of the drone stuff with the FAA. I have just a grayed out Part 107 license up here at the top. It's really exciting when you end up getting that. So that's what yours will look like when you get it. And then this registration number is the sticker that would go on the drone. Like I mentioned, the equipment is just as tightly regulated as the licensing itself. So you register your drone with the FAA. Now you have to make sure that your drone is remote ID compliant. And it's actually, the FAA is got a kind of bunch of knuckleheads working for them. So it seems complicated, but when you get down to it, it's not that bad. Really all remote ID means is that it's got the capability to transmit its ID while it's flying. Most drones, and mine is a 2019 model, mine's able to do that. So I don't have to go buy a new one. And then the second part would just be, once you've got your pilot license, you need to make sure that whoever you're working for or whoever you're working under, you're following their rules. And most companies have a whole suite of rules for operating drones. Here at the UC, because this is a research talk today, you need to make sure you check out the UC drones. I put the link in here, and almost everything is operated through their desktop app. So you just go on their website and you have to get registered. You put in all of your licensing information. You enter all the registration information for each of your drones. And that's how they regulate all of the projects. So anytime that you want to take your drone off at all, if you're registered or affiliated with your company, in this case UC, you then need to contact, put in an order that you're going to go do something with Brandon Stark, who operates the UC drone situation here. And then you get he tells you what you need to do, you get approved. It can happen really quickly. If you email him and say, hey, Brandon, I have this thing coming up. I need to have it like approved by tomorrow. Sorry, it's last minute. And he'll almost always be able to help you out. But usually it needs to be done in advance. And I guess the last thing I'll mention on that, because I want to make sure we cover everything today, is just that you don't have to tell them every time you're going to take off. When you have a project, you can say this project is happening every week on Friday for the next 6 months. Well, then he just approves it once and then you're good to go. You don't need to tell him that. Yeah, so a question here about the remote ID thing, since we're still on the equipment. So if you had an older model that didn't have the ID, would you be able to, would you have to retire it? So yes, starting on, I think it's September 16th. Yes, so if it doesn't have remote ID, you literally have to retire it, or if it's possible to do this, like with the Mavic, because it's so tiny, there's no real payload capacity. But with some drones, you can buy a remote ID module, and it's just a tiny little thing that you stick onto the drone, and that is what broadcasts the identification number. I don't know much about it, to be honest. I'm just glad that mine is capable. All right, then the last part of regulations, or the second to last part, I guess we have two more things to cover, is where can you fly? And that applies to the airspace and the land itself, and how you can fly, not just where, but how you can fly. All of this is regulated at every level, just so you know. In most cases, you're going to be thinking about, with the Part 107 exam, you'll be thinking about the airspace. So what airspace can I fly in? In most cases, that's just lower than 400 feet. You have to make sure you're not near an airport because there are certain airspaces you can't fly into. Flying over the land. You can't fly over land that you don't have express permission to fly over unless it's public land where it's already approved that you can fly there. So again, tightly regulated. I think I'll say this, I don't like drones. I like what drones are capable of, but I mean, they're cool, but I don't think they're that cool. I think they're really annoying because it's just like getting in a car and driving. Most people abuse it. Most people speed because that's just kind of the culture and there's not enough regulation. I might be starting to get into some hot waters here with people who might drive fast, but anyway, it's the same thing with drones. Most people don't think about private property law and the First Amendment. You're not allowed in anywhere to fly over someone's property without their express permission. And you're not actually, this is the law too. Most people don't know this. You're not even allowed to fly next to someone's property if your camera can see their property from where you're flying without their express permission. So if I went, to my apartment building and I got everyone's permission at the apartment building, if I flew my drone 30 feet above the building, it's going to see all the property around me. I can't do that unless I have their express permission. On top of that, the city of Davis has all of their own regulations about where you can fly drones. For the most part, drones are really not allowed at all in the city of Davis. I mean, you have to get a special permit. So anyway, there's lots of really crazy rules about that. You have to, one of them is not crazy, but lots of rules to know about. You have to keep your drone in line of sight, which means you have to always be able to see it. This becomes a little bit hard if you're trying to look at a silver drone that's now 3/4 of a mile away. But that's why Brandon will tell you rules like, hey, listen, I'm going to approve your project, but your drone needs to stay within 1,500 feet of you so that you can see it. So your radio signal will last for 3 or 4 miles. Should you ever fly your drone 3 or 4 miles away? No. So it's another one of those rules that's more regulated with your company. And then the last part I mentioned before, over people. You're not really allowed to fly over people. You have to usually get conditional approval for that. And again, private property and personal property, First Amendment rights, all of that applies. So, usually if you're recording people, you have to have their permission. So it just usually not, it's a good idea to never fly over people. And then the last thing I'll mention, we'll get to the questions, was the liability. So liability is a big thing. I mentioned at the beginning in the UC here, we have a $5 million liability policy. I don't know too many of the details of that, but $5 million sounds like a lot, but if you start a big wildfire, wildfires end up costing, hundreds of millions in damage. So $5 million may or may not help that much. And then the UC will be culpable for that anyway. So anyway, liability is the biggest part. If you end up leaving the university, you retain your Part 107 license and you want to use your drone, you need to get liability insurance. And it's really not that expensive. There's specific drone liability insurance you can buy online, reasonably priced. And it's especially reasonably priced if you go into business, because then that'll just be part of your overhead. You can get it for like $60 to $100 a month. Sounds like a lot, but if you're using your drone all the time, you're going to be charging people 100, 150 an hour. So you make up that in 1 hour work. So anyway, and yeah, recreational activities, again, you don't need liability insurance if you're doing anything for hobbyists, but anything non-hobbyist you do. Even if you're flying it recreationally, which I have done, you want to fly it somewhere where there's no liability of anything, because then you become personally liable and someone could sue you and ruin your life. So it's a very serious thing to take into account. All right, so now we'll get to some stuff in the chat here. So Emma, you said advisor wants to know why you haven't used drones. 2 of your 4 field sites are in Class B airspace, and 3rd is next to a prison. Oh, yes, that's a problem. And that is really hard, right? I mean, I had the research site that I really wanted to study. For 5 years, I had wanted to study it. I put everything together, I got the whole project together. I got approval from for land use, and I went to go fly, and I sent in my application to Brandon Stark to fly this site, and it was over by the airport. It was at the creek by the airport in the riparian reserve, and I got permission from the landowner on the other side. And Brandon said, well, you can't fly there because it's next to the university airport. And I said, we don't do anything important there anyway. Can't we just shut it down for the day? And he goes, no, we can't do that. There's no tower there. So anyway, I was never able to fly that site. So that's just something you're going to have to come to terms with, that you can't fly everywhere. So Karen said it's illegal for foreigners to fly drones in some countries. So yeah, these are just regulations here in the US. In some countries, drones are banned outright. You're just not allowed to fly them unless you work for the government, or you're not allowed to fly them, yeah, if you're not a citizen. Okay, yeah, Emma, taking images of industrial solar panels, which are very expensive. That's another thing, right? I mean, the drones are quite reliable now, but there are lots of these horror stories that people will tell you about. Oh, some drone caught this forest on fire. I'll show you a picture of that later on too. There's always a certain amount of risk, and that alone might be enough for you to, for someone to tell you not to fly there. Okay, yeah, so Michelle offered that if you can't fly drones, there might be other options. So look into satellite imagery is getting better and better, right? And so this planet education and research might be an option. So that's great. Thank you for offering that. Okay, yeah, so anyways, it seems like it really depends on the location. So for people here who do work in other countries or other states, just keep it in mind. All right, so if there's anything else on this, if there's not anything else, we'll just move on. Okay, great. So just following up on like, how do you actually get your Part 107? If you want to go into this, there's a process, right? There's a process for everything. I put the link in here, the FAA license. So if you want to go through that, it's linked on that page. It's all explained very well. Even when I got my license and, going 2019, going into 2020, it was really murky. It was hard to figure out what to do. It's 3 years later now, and it's way better explained. They've got much more outlined rules. So the process is easier. And they've got this great exam study guide. To be honest, I wouldn't worry too much about the exam. Just study for like a week. Don't study for any more than that. Don't put more than like 30 or 40 hours into studying, because it's really pretty easy stuff. A lot of it's technicalities. So if you're good at memorization, you'll do fine, but you just need to pass. So anyway, there's the exam study guide. Don't pay for online junk, by the way. Not worth it. Your time would be better spent elsewhere. And then the last part is when you get your license renewed, which I need to go do, by the way. When you go to get it, this is the one part that's not explained too well, is this like 61 versus non-61 renewal. 61 means that you're an actual pilot. So I doubt anyone here, chances are no one here is an actual pilot. So anyway, you would just be taking the regular non-61 Part 107 renewal. You have to do that every 2 years. It used to be every 3, now it's every 2 years. And it used to be you have to go in to take the exam again. Now you don't have to do that. It's just a 3-hour course. So just make sure that whatever documentation you're looking at for your regulations, it's up to date, because the regulations are changing constantly. So now it's just 3-hour training, you go online. When you go to take your first exam, I recommend just going over to the Sacramento Executive Airport. If you live in this area, you can't take it at SMF. You have to go to like a smaller airport. So I just recommend going here. I put the picture there because you literally just walk straight in the front door, go down the hallway, there's an office right there, and you walk in, you take your exam at a computer. It's kind of like taking the GRE. So anyway. And then on the right here, this is just a snip I took from the drone camp Part 107, like really quick cheat sheet, sort of by the numbers. So it has some simple rules in here to give you just an idea of some of the basic stuff that you would see on the exam and the stuff that you want to keep in mind when you're actually out there flying. So if you're out there and you are let's say you're a pilot and you're teaching people to fly. Well, because you're the only pilot, no one else is certified, you can only have one drone in the air at a time. So you can't have like 2 drones with the students. So that's kind of what that refers to. To be honest, I don't even know a drone that can go 100 miles an hour. That would be like a home-built gas-powered thing. So that would be kind of crazy. And then there's just some other stuff about like the distance you can fly, how far you can fly from things. Anyway, so there's some like basic information. Any questions on the Part 107 exam? Usually people have lots of questions about that. Okay, well then that's good. All right, the risk analysis. Again, I think it's a little bit more exciting because it comes into like logistics and planning. Risk analysis is most of the reason for the regulations. I think people will try to use common sense out there, but there are also some really good guidelines to keep in mind. And if you're doing research here at the UC, your best resource is the administrator, Brandon. He's the UC drones guy. So if you just need advice for your project, email him, say, hey, Brandon, I'm doing this project. I've got this problem. Emma, you were mentioning like airspace and those considerations. he might know about some kind of special approval that you can get. You know, there are things that they can actually do to modify air traffic for a certain period. So, you know, there are things that he knows about that you might not. Another thing might be the best management practices. So there's a list for the UC. And when you go to work for a company out in the industry, they're going to have their own BMPs. And I just listed some things here that I didn't pull these from the checklist. These are my own sort of best management practices. Is my site actually blocked off? When I go out there, am I making sure that it's safe? No one can get in or out, because obviously the drone can fall and hit someone, but there might be other things out there that maybe I'm doing an experiment. So just something that a good practice, block off the site. Have checklists. So when you go in and you're like preparing to go out in the field, you have a checklist for that to make sure you have the gear, that you've got all your regulations done. And then when you're in the field, you have a checklist there. It's very similar to being an actual pilot. So it's kind of cool in that regard. You know, you have a checklist. They say, okay, you know, engine number 4 flamed out. What's our checklist? And they have a checklist and it gets them back in the air. So it's really important. Play it safe. I'm going to go ahead and just say that, like, I am probably the most cautious pilot of most of the pilots that I've worked with. And not to like bash on any of the guys I've worked with in the past, but there's this culture in working with drones of not wanting to take risks, but everyone feels like they have a certain threshold that they're safe with. You know, they have, I mean, they could call it their comfort zone, like, oh, you need to stay in your comfort zone. I mean, that's good, of course, but some people don't have a comfort zone. They're okay with anything. And just play it safe. So it's just a good little word of advice there. And then the last thing is hire assistants. You know, if you're just going out and doing field work and you need some people to like have eyes on your drone, that was required by Brandon for one of my projects. It was a great idea because my drone got over the vegetation and I couldn't see it for half of the project. So I just hired an assistant to watch it, you know, paid him $20 an hour to stand out in the sun with a walkie-talkie. And I made sure that when I couldn't see the drone, they could see it and they could tell me what was going on. And so that's just something that it, again, adds a little bit of an expense, but if you're only out in the field for a half day anyway, you know, big deal. Really keeps you safe. And then there are, you know, all kinds of different components of risk to keep in mind. You know, this flying over people thing is a really big risk, so that's why it's not really allowed. The land ownership is another one. Most people don't think about that. I talked about it earlier. The site access and location, you know, I think another, Emma, again, like you were mentioning, one of your sites is next to a prison. That can obviously be a problem there because there's some law about it, but you might also just need to go and talk to the landowners and get their permission. I was able to get permission for all of the sites that I have ever had to do just by being polite and friendly and, you know, just getting on people's good side. You know, you have to use your people skills, even if you're in, you know, if you're like someone who's a scientist, like hardcore scientist, engineer, and you don't ever want to use your people skills, that's, you know, that can be me sometimes. You just need to buy into your people skills a little bit, get their permission. You know, I needed to call people's phone numbers. I was persistent. If they didn't answer, they were mad at me. Sometimes they were mad at me right away. I called the guy, I said, hey, you know, I want to fly out at your site. He's like, well, that's my parents' property. I'm like, yeah, I know, but they said that you run the property now, and they, you know, and he was really mad at me. And he's like, you need to, you know, what we need to find out there is that they need to rip all that vegetation back out, which is totally wrong, by the way. And I just said, yeah, you know what, I tell you what, I'll do whatever it takes. So, you know, there might be a little bit of people skills in there. Let's see, just a couple other things I think to mention here. You know, you need to have an emergency response plan. Stuff is going to happen. What are you going to do if your drone falls out of the sky and starts a fire? It could happen. You know, you're all going to fly over dry vegetation at some point. So you need to have a plan. What are you going to do? You can have a fire extinguisher, you know, water bucket. You should have a shovel. These are things that you think about so that you're ready for when it happens in the field. You know, if you do have a battery fire, what if your drone catches fire right there in front of you? What are you going to do about it? Battery fires can't be put out with water. So what, you know, what are you going to do? You know, weather is another risk. And that's just easily avoided by just pretty much not flying in bad weather. You know, but things get hot. So what are you going to do when it gets hot? So another component of risk. interactions with wildlife. This is probably where most people here in Davis will have the biggest risk when they go out in the field. The city of Davis almost didn't let me fly at South Fork Preserve because they were worried about bird strikes with my drone, and legitimately worried because a lot of birds have approached my drone in the past. And my drone, I think I got away with it. I got their permission. I didn't get away with something, but I got their permission because I convinced them that the rotors wouldn't actually hurt a large bird, and they won't. I mean, if a bird came and like ran into my drone, the drone would die and the bird would run away laughing, fly away laughing. So anyway, if you have a small drone, that's a lot better than a large drone for bird strikes, because they will sometimes attack the drone. So anyway, another thing to keep in mind. All right. Yeah, and then liability, that's the last part. So I have just I have this little table here as a reference for you. It's just pulled from the cheat sheet, from the drone cheat sheet for UC Davis. And it just gives you an idea of the permission that you might have when you have your like Part 107 license. That's our middle column there. So like it says like beyond line of sight, you're really not almost ever likely to have line of sight approved outside of line of sight approval unless you have a visual observer. And even then it can be hard. You're not going to be allowed to, like, for example, fly over terrain, because then your remote controller loses access with the drone. If you just fly beyond trees, the radio signal can get through the trees, but it can't get through terrain. So that's why it may or may not be approved. So anyway, that just gives you an idea of some of the approvals that you might get. Any questions on like risk management or regulations? I want to make sure folks aren't falling asleep here.
I'll just jump in and echo that weather is completely avoidable, but you really have to look at your weather reports. Same thing with like kite stuff, like get on your local weather, whatever your favorite weather thing is, look on Weather Underground and look at local conditions before you fly. It is potentially life-saving. So don't underestimate weather.
Yeah, thanks for that, Michelle. Absolutely. And I put this little graphic here. It's kind of hard to tell. It's the hourly weather forecast from NOAA. And you're going to need everything that's in this forecast. You shouldn't just be looking at like, oh, what temperature is it? Because I need to know whether to wear a sweatshirt or not. You're not a college student, right? You're a scientist. You need to think about all of these factors. So if it's going to be way over 100 degrees, you probably shouldn't be flying because your drone battery is going to heat up and you might have a problem. Or maybe you just don't think about the heat because your field crew might be overheated. It's something to think about all the time. People get heat stress, but also the wind conditions, right? Your drone can handle wind up to about 20 to 30 miles an hour, depending on which model it is. Like my little drone can't handle anything over 20, but the big ones can handle 30 plus. But you're also going to use more battery. So if you're getting gusts over 30 miles an hour, you probably shouldn't be out there. Because it's just going to blow the drone out of the sky. And once the drone flips over, it can't recover. It can recover up to like almost 90 degrees, but after that, it's just going to crash. And then you might, you're going to have $50,000 on the ground potentially. And then the last part would be the cloud cover, but we're going to get to cloud cover when we talk about mission planning. So anyway. All right, so yeah, now moving from like the risk analysis more to flight safety. So this is really just baked into the habits that you develop when you become a pilot. And it's very similar to the habits that you become, come into when you become a driver, right? Depending on who teaches you how to drive. For example, my dad taught me how to drive, and he's used to driving really big trucks with all kinds of equipment and dump trucks and tractors, like driving $500,000 down the road and lots of liability, obviously. That is exactly how you need to think about the drone. The drone it's easy to think that I just have this tiny little thing, I can't hurt anyone. It's very dangerous. It's not just you. You got to think about other people. It's the same thing as flying a car. That's the level of responsibility you're taking on when you fly your drone. So it's just something to think about when you get into flying. Practice everything, right? You need to practice taking off and landing in all kinds of conditions. Practice your basic maneuvers. You don't need to be really good at like flying it as a sport enthusiast. You just need to be able to always take control and know what buttons to push if you have a situation. So it's just one of those things that you want to make sure you're good at recovering and doing things in a safe fashion. So you don't need to be a great pilot. You just need to be, a safe pilot. That's really all that matters. And there are just a bunch of different things to think about when you're planning your flight for safe operation. The terrain is a big one. It's a big one even still. When I was coming into drones in 2019, 2020, the terrain tracking that drones had, which means they'll stay a certain height above the ground, that wasn't really that good. And it wasn't available with most applications. It was only available with like Ground Station Pro and one or two other softwares. And so people like me, we had to come up with we came into drones with the mindset that we always have to keep the terrain in mind. I've seen pilots, and I've even crashed into a mountain too, so trust me. But pilots crash into terrain because they forget that, the drone thinks that it's, you think the drone is 400 feet above you. In reality, the drone is 400 feet above you, but it's only 40 feet above the ground because it's upslope and it's going to crash into the mountain or crash into a tree. So that's kind of one thing to think about. The land cover is another one. Can you see beyond the trees or not? There may be some flexibility there. The weather conditions mainly having to do with wind, just another safety thing. Make sure you don't get blown out of the sky or blown into a power pole or something. You should never be so close to a power pole that the wind should blow you into it. But anyway, the altitude and airspace, even if you think that you are the only one operating in your airspace, I guarantee you're going to have some close calls. I've been flying drones out at Poudre Creek, and all of a sudden behind me, I'll hear this helicopter come out of the sky and almost crash into my drone. It's a pesticide helicopter spraying pesticides and herbicides all over the orchard. And I just had to pack up and leave for the day because unannounced, this helicopter came. The landowner who I got permission from didn't tell me about it. And because they're allowed to fly in airspace below 1,200 feet, I had no idea. So even if you know that your airspace is approved for you, that doesn't mean that you won't see other, things there, airplanes, drones. I've almost had other people's drones crash into me because they're hobbyists flying out there without permission. So anyway, you always need to be aware of that. And then this last one, I'll just mention it's a logistical factor, not a physical factor, is, drones are expensive. They can be expensive to get into, and so is research, right? Maybe you've hired your assistants, you've paid for your field work, and you've sent your people, and you're all out in the field. Maybe you've got, I don't know, a couple $1,000 invested in going where you're going to fly your site. That's a lot of pressure because you want to make sure that that's worth it. That happened to me. I spent about $1,500 on this project. It was actually here in town to collect a bunch of data. I was very restricted to a certain timeline because of the landowners and their operations. And that's when I had a whole bunch of issues and I got pressured, and I didn't, I didn't actually have any problems, but it was one of those learning situations where I got to a point a couple times where I said, man, I really need to fly today, or I really need to make sure I get some flight data today because anyway, the pressure can be there to do your project, but if it's not safe, just don't fly it. So you just should overestimate everything. If you say, well, we're going to be able to fly this site in 5 days, well, you should probably plan for 8 or 10 days. And then if you finish early, what's the worst that happens? You come home early and you're good to go. So don't plan for 5 days and then end up taking, being pressured and you get in a crash or something. Copter versus fixed wing is just the difference between the two different types. With the copters are safer because there's a lot more control and they can hover and they can fly at slower speeds. So fixed wings are usually for advanced operators. Anyway, just another thing to think about. So if you go that route of using a fixed wing, the level of safety goes kind of up a level. Autonomous flight, again, it's another thing where your drone, you're not flying your drone all the time. So for the people who are just getting into this, you only have your fingers on the controls for the takeoffs and landings and any emergencies if those happen. the rest of the time it's going to be flying its mission to make sure that it stays in, in perfect alignment with what it needs to get the pictures for. It's taking pictures at certain intervals, and it's flying at a certain speed. All that's controlled by the autopilot, but you need to be able to take over at any point. So if you're sending your drone far away and you can still see it, you need to make sure that not only can you see it, but you have the right perception of where it is, you have your feed, and you have a plan for how to bring it back if there's an emergency. And you're all thinking, like, what's an emergency? I mean, again, maybe there are birds that are circling that are trying to attack it. Maybe there's some emergency that you're dealing with on the ground. Maybe you just saw a plume of smoke and you need to bring your drone back because you need to get out of a wildfire area. That happened to me, actually. So anyway, all this stuff to keep in mind. Oh, yeah, Michelle, you put advertising planes. Yes, absolutely. Planes that just flying around carrying these banners. Oh, it's just crazy. I've had a lot of planes come out of University Airport here. I'm almost convinced we should just shut this airport down. It's just, I've seen so many planes come out of there flying really low, way below airspace. So anyway, all right. Well, I think any questions on that stuff? All right. So I have a little video here. So this is a video of my drone flying over Poudre Creek. So at this moment in this video, it's not taking pictures. The camera can only do one thing at once. And usually only one camera will be on, will be like giving you the feed at a time. So like if you have a drone with a multispectral camera and an RGB camera, both cameras are taking pictures at the same time. I mean, that makes sense, right? You want to just be able to do one flight and capture all the data you need. But you're only going to get the feed for the RGB camera. The multispectral camera, you're just going to have to check that data later on. So this feed right now is the video feed of an example of the drone doing an automatic flight, but it's taking video instead of pictures. So here it's like turning around at the end of a transect, and now it's going to do another transect. And we're over a levee. And there are a couple like things to check out here. So first is that, well, here it almost appeared, yeah, here my drone is flying straight. This was the point where my old drone, this is actually a replacement, the gimbal broke and it started to have problems where, and actually you can see it now, the drone is flying straight, but the gimbal is pointed slightly cattywampus, so it's not facing forward. So that's something that can happen. Then you can see my visual assistant walking on the levee down there. All right, and then I'm actually going to take this video back just for a second to show you another thing. So as we're flying over this ag field, notice it's got this, like, I forget what it's called. It's like this cornea of reflection underneath the drone. And that can happen with airplanes too. We're directly below the drone from the sun, the angle the sun is hitting it. The sun's rays are being bent by the gravity of the aircraft, and they focus down on this one point on the ground and reflect back. Anyway, it's just this cool physics thing that you can get. It's one of those features you would need to keep in mind for your flights. Yeah, so you can see the video is really great. This is like 4K video. Oh, we're landing now. This is pretty cool. And so you come down close to the ground, and anyway, I have some more demos later on in the links that you can watch videos of me demoing takeoff and landing. But takeoff and landing is another one of those things I want to just emphasize, do it safely. I've worked with probably, I think actually, I won't name them, but every single person that I have worked with for flying drones has been okay because they've used the Phantom. You can't actually catch my drone because it doesn't have a leg on the bottom to catch. So mine has to be landed on the ground. But most people use the Phantom, which has these rods on the bottom to land on. Everyone that I've worked with lands that in a way that they just catch it and like hold on to it. So they bring it down, and then once you grab onto the drone, the motors automatically stop. I think that's super unsafe. I would never do that. And I always told the guys I was working with, I'm like, I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I'm not doing that ever, because those drones, anything can happen and that'll take your eye out. One of those blades will easily take you. Even the blade, even on my drone, would take your eye out. So anyway, just recommend not doing that. Always just land it on the ground. It takes like, what does it take? 5 extra seconds? Anyway, it's just one of those things. All right. We'll keep plugging away here. Try to make sure we leave a little bit of time at the end for our little activity if people want. All right, so when you're doing the mission planning, you got to think about what kind of data you're trying to collect, plan out your study. There's, as you saw before, there's all kinds of stuff that you might need. Maybe it's just the imagery. Maybe you need a digital elevation model. Maybe you need the point cloud. Maybe you need multispectral data. Maybe you need all of it. So all of those are going to affect what kind of activity you do and just how big your site is, where it is it on terrain? Are you flying over trees? That's the kind of stuff that you got to think about from the beginning. Let's see, when you go into the mission planning tool, you work with the, when you go into the UC Drones app, you develop a project. So create your project, you got to check the regulations, see what airspace you're in. When you've got all of your project put together, you submit it for approval. Brandon is going to give you some feedback, and he might not approve it right away, or maybe he'll approve it, but with conditions, which means you got to follow certain conditions. Like he'll say, I'm approving this, but you need to have a visual observer. That even happens if you're out of, if you're within line of sight, but they're like, you need to have a visual observer, which is someone that's managing your site. So that means you're flying, but because you're surrounded by access to the site, people could be coming in and out. You have someone who's managing that's behind you that says, hey, you got to keep away. There's a drone flying here. Then you come up with your work plan for out in the field. I mean, this is just real basic field work stuff, but it's the extra level of safety because you've got so much liability. So you think about what field sites, how often, is this something where you're returning each week, you're returning each month? Maybe it's like a multi-year project. And then you have to download offline data. So that means that we'll look at this option maybe a little bit when we look at it on the tablet, but on your tablet, you download the maps for your missions in advance. So obviously out in the field, when you're working remotely, you're not going to have Wi-Fi because you might not even have cell service. So you just want to make sure you have all your maps downloaded offline in advance, and your drone has GPS, so you're good to go. It's just the maps for mission planning. So you download that in advance. You set up the autopilot missions that's what our exercise is at the end. So we'll look at like setting up the autopilot missions. I do recommend setting those up in advance. Even if you end up changing them out in the field, you've downloaded all the offline maps. So you're ready to go with your maps. And even if you completely change your missions, you've got your maps ready to go. Base maps like imagery or topography. And that is critical. So it's not just the maps anymore, but with terrain mapping, or terrain tracking, your drone will actually follow the landscape and stay the elevation that you prescribe above it, because we've got such good elevation models of the entire state now from the USGS. So it downloads all of that elevation data in advance for your drone as a transect, and your drone will make sure it tracks the landscape. So you can't fly if you don't have that. So that's critical. And then the last part, you just have an emergency plan. If a wildfire happens, where am I going to go? I had a wildfire happen when I was working up in Plumas. This was 2021, which was another really bad fire year. And I saw it was like the Beckworth complex fire. I saw that start, but it looked really close to me. And so fortunately, I was able to say, well, it's far enough away, but I'm going to implement my wildfire plan now, and I'm not going to stay an extra night. And so I ended up packing up my gear and I left. So you have an emergency plan for everything, which includes getaway routes. These wildfires move really quickly, so you just make sure you have all that ready to go in advance. And you have your inReach, which an inReach is just like it's a satellite GPS device. So you can, your way to get around, and you can contact SOS anywhere in the world. So that's another thing to budget for if you're, planning out your grants. And then you have to prep all your equipment. Again, it's another thing that you're all familiar with, because you probably do some kind of research, you go out in the field, you collect data, but it's the extra level of safety and the extra level of planning, because everything runs on electricity, right? So you got to charge everything. And you got to make sure you're practicing good battery management. I wanted to make sure I slipped that in at some point today, which was you have all these batteries. What I've done is I've numbered all of my batteries. So this one's number 8. So I number all my batteries to make sure I cycle through them so they all get used the same amount, and to make sure that they're, when I leave them for a long period, I leave them charged at about 60%. And that way they don't swell, because they'll swell and they'll degrade over time if you charge them to 100%. Most of these batteries are smart batteries, so they'll actually decharge to 60% if you leave them for longer than 3 days. So that's pretty cool, but why leave it for 3 days if you can just charge it to 60%? So just something to keep in mind. And then just plan for everything, right? Make sure you have data backup plan. We'll look at that a little bit later on. All right, see here. Field an earthquake tsunami plan. That's excellent, right? I mean, if you're working on the coast, if you don't come up with a plan, then, it's like, what's that is Murphy's Law. Anything that can go wrong will go wrong, or something like that. These are just a nice list of the key variables you would think about if you're planning for stuff out there, including the flight. We'll look at this for the mission planning exercise, like what altitude overlap, that sort of thing, what type of equipment, the terrain. Anyway, we've talked about some of this so far. The one I didn't mention was the cloud cover. Cloud cover, you can imagine, influences imagery a lot. This is the biggest deal with satellite imagery as well. I mean, an even bigger deal because the satellite is always going around the planet. So, satellites going around, they have to wait until it's that like one day a year that this satellite goes over, that it finally gets a picture where there's no cloud cover. It's the same thing with drones. If you're flying over a site, completely overcast is like, it's still not ideal because it's going to dim the amount of light, so your images will be a little dim. But completely overcast is still better than like partly cloudy, because you don't want patches. You don't want some light and some dark. Pix4D may or may not even be able to stitch it. Plus, your processing or your analysis will be messed up. So just think about the cloud cover. Bright sunlight is best. And then the other thing here is solar noon. You want to make sure that your solar angle is at its greatest during the day. So like in the winter here in the Northern Hemisphere, we're at like, what are we, about 30, 40 degrees. You're going to be flying in the winter for only about 3 hours in the middle of the day. And in the summer, you can fly for 4 to 5 hours in the middle of the day because we have more high solar angle in the summertime. So anyway, it's just another thing to think about. If you fly over water, you may or may not need bathymetry. I'll show you an example of that later because the drone can't always capture underneath the water very well. In fact, usually it doesn't. And the last part, which we won't talk too much about today, are these ground control points. I'll give you a couple examples. They enhance the geographic accuracy of your data. So you add ground control points to make sure that your data is aligned very accurately with the surface of the Earth. And it actually helps your image processing. So it'll stitch your images better together if you have that as well. All right, I don't think we're gonna have time to go through too much of this. I go through a few things in this video if you wanna access the video after the seminar today. How do you fly a drone? How does the drone fly itself? It's all operated through a software through the tablet. So you need to make sure that you have a tablet. I mean, you can fly the Mavic without a tablet. You can just use the RC. But if you're going to be using it for videography or imagery or use any kind of program, all of that's run through the tablet. So that's your key to everything, is the tablet. This is just a slide showing the ground control points. So on the upper left is an image of an area of that video I showed you a few minutes ago. Right here, there's this little ground control point. It's actually pretty big. It's about 4 feet by 4 feet. And that little ground control point, you see that in multiple different images. And that helps with the stitching, but it helps better with the geo accuracy. So it'll like warp your image in such a way, your orthomosaic, to make sure it's better aligned with the surface of the Earth. And it's quite accurate if you use an RTK GPS. And I have another link for that. I mean, the RTK equipment I used for this was actually RTN, real-time network. It got it down to less than a centimeter horizontal accuracy and like a centimeter vertical. So it's very accurate. If you do place these ground control points, again, this is an entire session in drone camp. place them evenly across your site. You know, you're going to have some really long, skinny ones like this. That's okay. Do your best to place them evenly across the site. So that's kind of the ground control point. I just threw this one in here to show you that you can see this one ground control point from 8 different images. So that's, you know, that's important because when you're actually doing your ground control point process in the processing, you'll be able to click in all of the images that you see this, and that will help with the geo accuracy. So sometimes you can see these in up to 15 or 20 images, depending on what your overlap is. It's pretty great. I have a nice slide here. Things will go wrong. You know, be prepared. They will go wrong. Did anyone notice anything about this image? Or orthomosaic, rather. All right.
It looks like it's 2 different colors.
Yes, 2 different colors. I see. Yeah, white balance. Okay. Yes. So great. On the left is more purple, and on the right is more yellow. So on the left was using my old Mavic, not this one, but the one. The reason I got this was because of this. I was flying this site. I got halfway through, and you can actually see where the drone pooped out. So it got both directions. So I had to fly 2 different directions here. I got all the way up to the middle here where this line is. And then it only got the latitudinal direction for this little middle section, and then it pooped out. The gimbal died, and so the camera wouldn't work. So then I had to go get someone else's drone, and I tried to adjust the ISO settings on the camera and all of that, but yeah, the white balance was wrong. And so Pix4D is really good, so it was still able to stitch this imagery really well, but it still was messed up. Fortunately, I'm not going to be doing image classification with this. I wanted the DEM, but it looks kind of cruddy. So anyway, this kind of thing is going to happen out in the field, and you just need to accept your data for what it is, right? Kind of think diversity, equity, inclusion, but just for your data. It's the same concept. I like to throw that plug in there. I'll put this is in the slides, but there are all of these resources for planning your missions, from like getting the topography resources that might help you out with some of it, what airspace restrictions there are. Solar Noon is a really helpful one. That'll tell you like what time of day you should be flying, what time of year, that sort of thing. And then data management, just really quickly. Again, lots of data all the time. These drones are taking such high quality pictures and videos that you need an SD card that has a very fast write speed, WRITE, write speed. So I recommend something like, again, I'm not like a salesperson for this product, but something that would be the speed of this like SanDisk Extreme Pro. So like the highest level, the fastest speed possible. And they are expensive, but again, it's just one of those things that you should budget for. That way it can write everything it needs to onto that as quickly as possible. Because if it's taking pictures faster than it can write to it, it's just not going to write the picture. So it's going to skip pictures and you'll miss data. So again, it's something you won't want to skip out on. You have raw data, you have the data that you process, and then everything you analyze. So there's lots of data all the time. This is why you need that vast computing power. So these are the slides I have the XPS on. Again, not a salesperson, but something like the XPS that has that level of durability and power. That's what I'd recommend. And then the last thing would be these external drives. So you want to make sure you take an external drive in the field with you. So you'll have 3 copies of your data, or at least 2. So you'll have your SD cards. You'll wipe your SD cards because you want to reuse them and you don't want them to get full of data. Then you'll have a copy of the data on your laptop, and you'll have a copy on the external drive. Again, back up everything. You don't know what's going to happen. Your laptop could explode, but at least you have the external drive. Yeah, let's see anything in the chat here. Yeah, speed is marked on the card. Yeah, great. So just check out what the speed is, and whatever this one is rated for, go ahead and just plan for something like that. Oh, does UC Davis have a Pix4D map or educational license? They do. You just need to make sure you reach out to the right person. I get mine every year from ArcGIS out at UC-ANR. I just email them and say, hey, I need my license for another year. It's like $150. and they'll send you the code. So yeah. Oh, and thanks for the link, Alex, for speed.
I'll also add that I'll put the link in the chat, but last quarter, instead of this planned workshop, I did a quick kite aerial photography workshop. I talk about Open Drone Map, which is free and open source, which also can stitch things and do DMs and stuff like that. So that's another option too, if adding the cost of a Pix4D license is too much. Come talk to me about open options.
Great, thank you so much. Yes, I have been someone who's really only used the industry standard for everything. So there's always going to be, almost always going to be an option out there for open source or something that's cheaper.
In some cases, I'm just going to throw out there, open source actually is the industry standard. So just because you pay for it doesn't make it necessarily better. So just look into your options, but Pix4D is great as well.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I worked for Derek Young for a summer when I did a ton of field work for him in the forest. He uses Agisoft, or at least at the time, he uses Agisoft Metashape. And for the life of me, I couldn't figure out how to run it. It was significantly cheaper than Pix4D. It was like whatever license he needed was only like $200, but I couldn't figure out how to run it. So some of the programs, if they're not the industry standard, or maybe they're harder to use, but they're cheaper. So there's this trade-off. So it depends on what route you want to go. I mean, it's very similar to like that with GIS, right? Like, RStudio, lots of capability, more flexible, open source, or do you just want to use ArcGIS Pro? It's expensive, but a lot, maybe more intuitive to use. I don't know. So lots of those trade-offs. All right, yeah, thanks. Some more links in there from Alex and Michelle on the. Okay, so there's just this zoomed into this location. And then one of the problems I wanted to point out from this was just, I didn't just have a problem with the orthomosaic, but also with the DEM. So notice, we'll look right here in the middle. So you can see the blue is the lowest elevation where the creek is. That's the lowest elevation in the channel. And if we go, toggle back and forth, you can see this section where in the DEM, it's blocked off like there's an obstruction in the channel. That's because it couldn't see under the vegetation. The vegetation was so thick that even though my camera was going two different directions, so I have latitudinal, I have longitudinal, and the camera from the latitudinal angle was also pointed an angle to try to get under the canopy. It still created these, what I just call kind of landscape artifacts. So there's really nothing there. So I need to go in and do bathymetry in this whole channel and then add that on to this DEM to replace the channel DEM. So anyway, it's just another thing to think about with vegetation. This is just a sample of a meadow I flew in the Sierra. So just another sample of that. We don't have time to talk about it. All right, so this is good. We have like 25 minutes to do this if people want. If you don't want to do the activity, that's okay. So I have new Pix4D. Pix4D capture is not necessarily the greatest, but it's easy to like create an account and just show you a few things. So I recommend, let's see here. Yeah, this next slide has the instructions. So go ahead and download, if you want to take part in this, go ahead and download Pix4D capture on a tablet or phone and create an account. I'll leave you a couple minutes for that while I'm kind of chatting about these things. So just have your phone or tablet ready to go, and then I'll chat about a couple things. All right, so we're doing this mission planning, and this is a whole section of getting into drone work. It's not just working on the tablet, but mission planning is a type of software that you use. The Pix4D capture is free, and that's another reason that we're using it, is you don't have to pay anything for at least Pix4D capture. And by the way, if you don't have time today, I give you like a brief introduction to it in this video. It's from 2020 during the pandemic, so don't judge too much. But anyway, that video has some stuff in there. We're not gonna have time today to do the ortho mapping exercise. Maybe that's something I can do next year. But this tutorial from ArcGIS Pro, they give you the data, they give you detailed instructions, and they use ground control points. ArcGIS Pro ortho mapping is not that good. but it, you know, it does the job for some cases. So it'll give you a really good idea as to how it works. And then I'll also give you this drive folder with the link. I'll put this link in the chat. Actually, I can put this in the chat now since some people might need to leave. Yeah, I don't know if it's Pix4D Capture or Capture Pro. Is there just a regular Pix4D Capture available?
Oh, so this is Naomi. I'm doing this on my phone, not my tablet, and I only see Pix4D Capture Pro on my Android. And I wouldn't have asked, except mine only has 1,000 downloads and not 100,000 downloads. So I didn't know if I was like way off base, but I can give it a try. It has the same picture that yours does.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just Pix4D Capture. I wonder if it's a Google versus Apple thing. Yeah, I think it's just the Pix4D Capture. I'll put it in the chat.
The website says Pro is new. So I think it's a renaming, rebranding.
Okay, well, it might look different, so if you can go with the Pix4D Capture. I think that's the one that I have downloaded on my device.
It's the same app.
Okay, great. And I'll just send everyone this drive folder so that if you need to head out, you can. Yeah, so there's not, the only thing that's in that folder now is the slides from today, but at least it has the resources. And I guess while people are still downloading the app and kind of creating an account and signing in, I'll share my screen again, and I just have a couple of things to mention about Drone Camp. All right, so today was obviously pretty rushed. And there was all kinds of stuff that I covered on just sort of a superficial surface level. So closing thoughts, go out and get experience doing this kind of stuff. And I recommend getting experience with different people, because if you just go with one person, you're going to think that that's how everyone does it, or that's just how things are done. And that's just not true. If you go to Drone Camp, it's great because you're going to get exposure from all kinds of professionals and people who work in the industry. But, you know, I've worked with guys and gals in different labs, and every lab has a different process, and they have very strong, each one has very strong opinions about how to do things. I've tried to do things in the way that minimizes my little liability and also is the least amount of work, just because I've always been pressed for time. So that's been my kind of prerogative, but other people do things for certain ways. Like I know Derek Young, you know, he likes to use stuff that's totally not mainstream because he just likes to not support these companies that are super corporate. So anyway, you're going to get a different perspective with different people. And there are labs out there that have drones that you can try to get experience with. So that's great. I don't think flying the drone is that fun. That might be a little heinous to say, but it's kind of like once you've done it for the first 15 minutes is kind of cool. And then you're like, okay, and you're bored. And then the rest of it is like trying to plan your missions, and that's the fun part. And then I would just go ahead and attend Drone Camp if you can. There's a virtual option. It's usually $70, but because it's so close to the Drone Camp date now, it's $100 virtually. It's $500 for students to go in person, and I think it's $800 or $1,000 for people who are not students. So I highly recommend it. It used to be 3 days, and now it's 4. Or is it 5 now? I think it's showing 5. It used to be 3. And they've got last year's videos posted, which doesn't cover everything. So anyway, just recommend going. It's super great. And I've got this short video for just like, if you needed the 20-minute version of what we did today, that's a video I made. So anyway. Okay, do we want to get started with the Pix4D thing? Or are there any questions about stuff from the presentation? People ready to get started? What's the status?
Are you able to show us how it works? Like I'm not planning on actually downloading the app on my phone just for space reasons, but are you going to be able to actually show us what it looks like?
Yeah, so in the presentation, let's see what slide it is. So yeah, on the slide that says mission planning and ortho mapping exercises, the first link in there that says like, watch this video minutes 13 to 16:25, that will show you exactly what we're doing today.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah. Okay, is anyone going to be following along? Because I don't have to. My tablet's also kind of malfunctioning. Is anyone going to be following along or not really?
So you can give a thumbs up or something like that if you don't want to speak up, or put something in the chat.
Yeah, we don't have to.
Yeah, I was working on getting this downloaded, but I'm having trouble getting an account set up. So I'm fine if you just want to. I mean, if I'm speaking for me, it's okay.
Yeah. So
okay.
if you want, we can just do questions, or if you have something else planned. It sounds like folks are willing to try it on their own.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I mean, so what I'm going to do is I think, well, I don't know if this stuff will be visible. See if I can. All right, is that kind of visible? I don't know. I don't know how much you can see. All right, great. So yeah, so again, like Pix4D is not the most, it's not the best. It's what I had to use because I sort of mistakenly bought Google tablets. I wouldn't do that. I would buy Apple tablets. Don't plan to use your smartphone for drone work. It's just not powerful enough. You need to buy a tablet, buy an iPad, and buy a good iPad. Buy one that's like this big or maybe a little bit smaller. Because these are, and the reason iPad, because I love Samsung and they have really powerful Samsungs now. And I really don't like Apple products that much, but iPads are compatible with DJI Ground Station Pro. So that's what I recommend because it's a lot more capable. And anyway, it's just a lot less glitchy, and there's the ability to pause a mission when the battery runs out, come back, and then restart that same mission. Whereas in Pix4D, you have this mission set up here, and if the battery runs out, it doesn't keep its place. And so then you have to like estimate where the battery pooped out and then like make a new mission. It's really terrible. Okay, yeah, so Alex mentioning drone deploy does the same thing. So yeah, there are multiple options now. I really liked Ground Station Pro when I used it. I thought it was really good, and it never glitched on me in like hundreds of missions, whereas Pix4D would glitch like every third or fourth mission. It was terrible. But you know, Pix4D is one of those things that's really easy to learn the principles on. So it's like a nice teaching tool. So, you know, if you open this up, there are all kinds of things in here. You know, the settings up, the settings up here in the corner are just going to show you like the different drone types that you can have. You can change the drone type, and that'll tell you how long your battery is going to last. You can adjust the speed from the settings. So the speed will affect how long it's in the air, the altitude, what kind of overlap you have. So if you're going to have 80% overlap versus 90%, it's going to increase the number of pictures you have. What is it? It's double or quadruple the number of pictures. So it's a significant amount just to increase overlap by that much. The other thing is just to always keep in mind what the amount of mission time it is it's going to take. This will be in different places. Like here on Pix4D, it's down here in the corner. And in this case, the mission is saying 9 minutes flat for my model drone for the Mavic Pro. So you just make sure that you've got the right drone. It's estimating the right amount of time, and you know that you've got the right altitude. The other metric that's super helpful, depending on what kind of data you need, is right up here, at least in here, this is where it says the ground sampling distance. And that just means like, what's the resolution of your data? So in this case, our resolution is going to be, each pixel will be just under 4 centimeters. So that's super helpful for planning what kind of data you can get out of it. So The altitude is going to affect your flight time. So if you fly at a low altitude, longer flight time because it can't cover as much area in each picture, but it's also a higher resolution. So it's constant trade-offs that you're balancing. So that's one of those things that if you're inexperienced, you just need to make sure that you go talk to someone who's a little more experienced with that, like Brandon, or maybe go get a free consultation with ArcGIS. Or, someone here like, Alex has experience with drones. Just talk to someone that could give you a better idea of what altitude, what speed, that sort of thing you should be flying at. In most cases, you'll be flying at the max speed the drone can fly for efficiency. All right, so a few comments here. Industry standard. It's very varied. I just recommend the Ground Station Pro because I really liked working with it, and I found the combination of the iPad with Ground Station Pro very reliable. Yeah, again, it's not necessarily an industry standard. I mean, like Sean Hogan swears by Pix 4D. I had terrible luck with it though, so it just totally depends. All right, are there any other questions or anything else? Sean's the only one. Yeah. Sean is a lucky guy. Got good karma. There's one thing that I kind of forgot to mention. So I met with Brandon the other day and he was all funny about it. He's like, hey, listen, I heard you're giving this drone talk. We need to meet now. And Brandon works at UC Merced. And so this was kind of weird. So anyway, we meet outside of Hunt Hall one day and he's like, hey, listen, there's this executive dean here at UC Davis that is trying to ban DJI drones in the College of Ag. And this is true. And it's, anyway, nothing is for sure yet. We haven't gotten any official guidance, but there's an executive dean, this is an assistant dean, someone who has nothing better to do, who wants to ban DJI drones because they're Chinese and they're worried about espionage. There's no evidence of this. There's no evidence of espionage, but it's a cautionary thing because we have such terrible relations with China right now as a country. I'm not saying UC Davis. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that out there. It would upset everything because if the College of Ag did it, that would lead to the entire UC doing it. And 98% of the drones used in the UC are DJI drones. It would shut down drones across the UC. So anyway, just something to think about. And yeah, as far as industry standard, DJI in this case really is the industry standard. The only other drone that anyone really ever thinks about using for research applications, in most cases, like these kinds of like quadcopters and fixed wings, is the EB, which is that expensive fixed wing I had a picture of earlier. Almost all of the US made drones are not that good and they're really expensive. The only one that's like halfway decent, not nearly as good as the DJI drone, is about $11,000. So anyway, just something to think about. Well, I'm all done.
Well, thank you so much, Clancy, for giving us so much information. I know it's a lot to convey to people about how you do this. There are so many pieces to this kind of research, even before you start thinking about flying. So I think this gave people some really good information about how to get started and a lot of good things to think about. And definitely, let me or any of the Maptime Davis Council folks know if anyone else out there has, presentations you'd like to give on drones or anything related to it. Also post-processing, we'll be looking for more things coming up in the next school year. And this is one of those things where we can never have enough information because there's so many moving parts. So thank you so much for doing this. I will end our recording here, and I think I have time to hang on for a few minutes if you have questions, and if Clancy can hang on, he can let us know. But anyway, thank you so much. I very much appreciate this, and I'm glad we finally got to do this.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was good.